see generalization of called computing networks. So this was initially made to compare different architectures. So just let me share my screen. So this published in a paper, you can find the link here. But we'll see briefly particle swarm optimization, which is a search algorithm inspired on bird flocking. Then we'll see computing networks, which is a generalization of many different computational models. And we will use this to compare different computational models, which one is better or worse, or what are the properties. So just to review, last Tuesday, we saw a bit of synchronization. More generally, we spoke about oscillators, which are basically periodic systems. Any system with a periodic behavior can be described as an oscillator. And then there are different types of coupling when you have a collection of oscillators. Synchronization is when all the oscillators have the same phase, but you can have all sorts of different coordinations. Synchronization, let's say a common one, but not the only one. I mean, you can have anti-synchronization, or you can have dephasing, where you try to, so for example, in public transport, you want the opposite of synchronization. Say if all the trains arrive at the same time or all the buses arrive at the same time, that's terrible. You want them to be evenly spread. So that would be the equal headway instability problem. So it's related, because just like there are some mechanisms that for synchronization, you try to kind of bring together towards a similar phase different elements. In this equal headway instability problem of public transportation systems, you want to spread them out with their neighbors, and that will give you even superoptimal behavior. So particle swarm optimization was proposed in the 1990s. So you have simple agents, which are called particles, and they move in a search space. Remember, we already saw this abstraction where you have a problem of n dimensions, then you can see these problems together with the resolution as an n-dimensional space. So if you have two variables and of one function, you can see this as a surface, and then the height of the surface, which would be the value of the function for the two xy coordinates. That would give you the value of the function. So you might want to try to maximize or minimize that function. And then search algorithms can be seen as navigating through this space. If you have two variables, it would be a surface. If you have more, it's just an n-dimensional space. So if we visualize this space of the problem, then the particles have a coordinate, and then they will move similarly, well, a bit inspired by flocks of birds. Basically, you have a set of particles, which is called the swarm, and they have positions and velocities. So you might want to start with particles evenly spread around the search space, because this would allow you to kind of explore in parallel different regions of the parameter space. And then the velocities, that's one of the many tricky details of search algorithms, that depending on the particular search space, you might want to have a high velocity, because let's say the differences between different regions of the state space are low, so then you want to explore it fast. But then if the differences between one region and its neighboring region are very big, you want to explore it slower, because otherwise you might miss a good solution that lie between two evaluations if you are kind of giving large steps. And so each particle stores a personal best position, basically the solution. And also they receive information from the neighbors in a graph. There are different variants. One, the neighbors are fixed at the start of the run, and then they don't change. It has advantages and disadvantages. In another version, let's say every time step you kind of search for which ones are your neighbors and then update the the velocity of each particle according to and the orientation of each particle according to the neighbors. So collectively, the different particles explore the space until some solution is found. So in the first step is to initialize the positions and velocities. You can assign neighbors in different ways. It can be each particle has the same number of neighbors, or different particles, different number of neighbors, depending on different considerations. And it's not that one is better than the other. It also depends on the search space. Some assignments are better for some search spaces, and so on. So the main loop, basically you update velocities of the particles with their information of their neighbors. So just like in a flock of voids, they try to keep an average velocity. And then you update the position. So you just add the velocity vector to the position, and that gives you the new position. And then you update the best solutions. Basically, you evaluate the function for the new positions. And then if these are better than the best one that has been found for each particle, then you update that best solution. So, I mean, you can find more detailed descriptions of particle swarm optimization online. It's a well-known method. But then we can generalize these and other methods with computing networks. So computing network has n nodes, k edges, an algorithm A that it computes a function f. The nodes and edges can have internal variables, and functions determine how the state of the nodes and edges change. You can have stochastic or deterministic computing networks, depending on whether the functions and algorithms are stochastic or not. It can be synchronous or asynchronous, discrete or continuous, and so on. So you can see that there's some inspiration from random Boolean networks, similar notation. So these are representation of an artificial neural network with computing networks. So if you have never seen an artificial neural network, well, this is a way of representing it. There are lots of different flavors of neural networks, but you basically have units, also called artificial neurons. And here they're represented as nodes, and they are connected by synapses, connections. The neurons have functions, so they have inputs, and then these inputs are usually weighted. So they have a value that it comes either from an input or from another neuron, and then you multiply that for a weight, and then each edge has a weight. So basically, the activation function of a neuron is usually a sigmoid, which is usually the weighted sum of the inputs. So you multiply, let's say, the outputs of these nodes, or maybe they're just sensors. So whatever the sensor is reading, you multiply it by weights of these edges, and then you sum them, and then there's this activation function, and that will give you the output, whether the neuron fires or not. These activation functions are usually sigmoid curves. So basically, there's like a threshold so that the input values have to go beyond that threshold, and then this would simulate like a neuron firing. In many cases, it's artificial neural networks have gone way too far from biological plausibility. Initially, they were inspired by real neural networks, but in many cases, they just keep the name because you basically, as an engineer, want these things to classify or to perform another function, and you don't care whether there's any realism to them or not. So, for example, support vector machines, they're one type of neural network, but they have nothing to do with real neural networks. So anyway, you can represent this general type of neural network in terms of computing networks. So you have nodes that are the neurons, edges are the synapses, and then the algorithm basically changes the weights of the synapses. So, for example, backpropagation algorithm, that's what it does. You compare the output, which would be a subset of the outputs of the neurons. I mean, you can have one neuron that is the output, that would be your function, or you can have two neurons that are outputs, that would be your function of the whole network. So it's a subset of the outputs of the nodes. And backpropagation algorithm and others have a similar rationale behind them. Basically, they compare your outputs for a given input, and then let's say you train them by comparing, let's say, what your neural network is giving you to what you would like your neural network to give you. So you have a training set, and that gives you a set of inputs and outputs. And if your neural network for the inputs gives you a very different output, then you need to adjust the weights. And the backpropagation algorithm basically measures how much different weights contribute to the error of the function. And like this, you adjust the weights and converge to a function that reproduces as best as possible the training data. And it had been shown that if you have a large enough neural network with at least 3 layers, then you can approximate any continuous smooth function. So let's say they're very powerful, and they converge really quickly. Of course, there are more complicated tasks, and deep neural networks can solve some of these tasks where you have, let's say, 8 or 20 layers. And for this, you need larger training data sets and huge computing power. But let's say they're able to recognize images much better and recognize voice. And let's say they are very well capable at recognizing certain data sets. This doesn't mean that they're able to do everything. They're also, I mean, looking at the whole range of things that humans or other animals can do, they're very limited. They're very well at what they do, but they're limited on the variety of different things they can do. Then there is colony optimization. Let me switch to net logo. So this would be like an intermission. Because it will be easier to explain colony optimization, which is another optimization method with NetLogo. And then we'll go back to presentation. So in the model library, there's the biology section, there is model ants. So I'll just use this to show what the algorithm is inspired in, which is ant foraging. So here we have the ant nest in the center and 3 food sources. And then the ants, well, you have ant agents, and they explore their environment, and I mean they mimic the behavior of some species of ants. Different ant species have different strategies for foraging, but some of them in certain environments have this strategy that has been used as inspiration for ant colony optimization. So basically they explore randomly, and then when they find food source, they return to the nest in a straight line, and they leave a pheromone trail. Pheromone is like a perfume, so other ants can detect pheromone gradients. So you can see here that the white is like a high pheromone value, and as it turns to darker green, let's say it recedes because pheromones evaporate. So what you can see is that the food source that is closer, simply because it's closer, it's able to recruit more ants because they can reach the nest faster, and then more ants gather, and then they get some food, and then they return to the nest, and then they reinforce the pheromone trail. And like this, let's say some ants go to the other food sources, but they finish it. And once the first food source is finished, some ants arrive, but then they don't find anything, so they don't reinforce the pheromone trail, and it evaporates, and then they can explore and join this other food source that other ants were exploiting already. And when they finish it, the pheromone evaporates, and they start exploring again. And the farthest one needs a bit more time, but you can see that it starts gathering more ants, and when they reach a certain number, then the pheromone trail is preserved until it's finished, and then it evaporates, and then they keep on exploring but don't find anything because the food is finished. So we can play with the parameters. If the evaporation rate is higher, then let's say they need more ants to find the food source so that they can recruit more ants. So let's say in this sense, it would be a bit more exploration and less exploitation. If you decrease the evaporation rate, then it's more exploitation and less exploration. But then this will make that, let's say, the ants that are detecting the food source from the far side will recruit some other ants, and then, let's say, this is in principle less efficient because they need to go longer. I mean, once there is no other option, of course, you are better getting the food from a farther source than not getting food at all. But yet, again, it's a balance between exploration and exploitation. So it's actually quite tricky to find the optimal evaporation rate for your optimization algorithm. And that's a problem of all optimization algorithms. You need to optimize the parameters in which you will make the search. So for example, if you have genetic algorithms, what's the optimal mutation rate? That will change with the problem that you are trying to optimize. The evaporation rate in ant colony optimization varies with the problem you're trying to optimize. In particle swarm optimization, the speeds and the size of the neighborhoods and the size of the swarm vary depending on the problem. So Odin writes, I've seen that simulation several times in its code, but still can't get how one could use this idea of ant colony optimization to do something like PSO. Is that possible, or only as an algorithm, for example, robot search? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll explain now how ant colony optimization works. So, if you want, feel free to see in the NetLogo model more about how it works and the code, and play with the code, explore with the parameters. So I think the diffusion rate originally was 10. If we increase the diffusion rate, what happens? Seems it doesn't make much of a difference. Basically, it seems they managed to recruit more ants. And then you can also see, for example, if you vary the population, how does that affect the time they will take to exhaust all the food sources or find the first food source, or you can compare how this model behaves. But anyway, returning to presentation and colony optimization, it can also be represented as a computing network. So in this case, well, there's a theorem that it can be shown that any optimization problem can be translated into shortest path. It can be translated into the problem of finding the shortest path in a graph. So this is like traveling salesman problem, like problem. Basically, you have lots of nodes. Basically, you can imagine these are cities, but I mean in an n-dimensional space, and there are some paths between these, and there's some cost or some distance that it will take you to traverse one edge. And then you want to go through all of the different nodes through the shortest path. And of course, this is a combinatorial explosion because the number of possible paths explodes exponentially with the number of nodes that you are trying to visit. So actually, there are international competitions focused on the traveling salesman problem. I mean, if you have tens of thousands of nodes, it becomes really hard computationally to improve solutions because you cannot explore exhaustively that search space. And it has some structure, but it's not, let's say, very smooth. So, I mean, there is lots of research that focuses on this type of things. Amari writes in the chat, some months ago, I read a paper where the authors make analogies between ant colony strategies to search food and T-cell in the immune systems to repel diseases. That's interesting. In the chat, there's a link to the paper. So in ant colony optimization, you have n nodes, and then you have a collection of ants. These again are agents, and then they will travel along these nodes, and they will try to minimize their path. And basically, they arrive at the nodes and then see which other nodes they can visit from there, and then the edges have a pheromone value. So when the ant traverses through that edge, they increase that value of pheromone, and that increases the probability that other ants will also go through that edge. So let's say there's like a bias roulette for each ant when they decide which node to visit next. And it's biased by the pheromone value of the edges, and also about the weight of the edges. So if it's, let's say, if you want to maximize the length, then you basically want the highest values for the edges and pheromones. If you want to minimize, so for example, distance, then you try to minimize the, let's say, the weights, but then you multiply the inverse of the distance with the pheromone value, so that you try to go with let's say, the higher pheromone will decrease the value, and then you try to minimize the weight. So in this case, the shortest paths get reinforced by the pheromones, but since the pheromones evaporate, if, for example, there was a local optima, and then many ants went through there, but then it's like a dead end, then that will evaporate with time, and then probably they will find a better path. So the function would be to find the minimum of all possible paths that the ants have. For you have k ants, and the algorithm basically changes the pheromone values of the edges. And it's very simple because they just evaporate constantly by a certain percentage. But then how fast that percentage evaporates, it's what I was saying, that it's very tricky. So you repeat this lots of times, and then you will end up with usually with a very good solution. And finally, going back to particle swarm optimization, but now to present it in terms of computing networks. Here, it makes sense to represent nodes as particles or particles as nodes, and then you link them with their neighbors. So each node has a position x, which is a vector, a velocity, which is also a vector, the best solution, which is another vector. It's basically the best position that it has found, that it has visited, and then the function y, it's a function of the position, and then the links share the best solutions to their neighbors and also the velocities, and the function would be the minimum b, which is the best solution that the particles have found for all particles. And what the algorithm does is to change the variables of the nodes. So if you remember, in neural networks and in ant-colony optimization, the algorithm changes the variables of the edges. And here it's the nodes which are updated. So you basically change the positions and the velocities for all particles. So we can compare these different algorithms using computing networks. So the nodes for in the neural case are neurons or units, and they have a function which is the activation of the weighted sum. In ant-colony optimization, the nodes are locations which have ants, which have paths. In particle swarm optimization, the particles have a position, velocity, the best solution, and the function. And then the edges in neural networks, you have synapses which have weights. In ant-colony optimization, you have trails, and they have a heuristic value, and which is basically like a weight or cost for traversing that edge, and the pheromone concentration. And in PSO, you have relationships which are the best solutions of your neighbors. And as I mentioned, in the first two, the algorithm adjusts the edges, and in PSO, it adjusts the nodes, or the variables of the nodes. And the function, neural networks, is a composition of functions of nodes. In ant-colony optimization is the shortest path, and PSO is the best solution. So you can see actually that even when we might think that ant-colony optimization and particle swarm optimization are more similar because of their biological inspiration, in the sense that, say, swarms and ants, they seem to be both insects, so then they should be similar. But actually, at this abstract level, ant-colony optimization is more similar to neural networks than to particle swarm optimization. Of course, both have differences, but since the algorithms adjust the edges, they're more similar in that sense to neural networks than ant-colony optimization and particle swarm optimization. So, of course, if to try to decide which one is best, it always depends on the problem. And also, we can see that we have at least two dynamical scales, a slow one, which would be given by the algorithm, and the fast one, which is basically the function. So almost every time steps, you evaluate the function one or more times so that you can get a value of where you are. So basically, it's a way of exploring the state space. But then the algorithm, it's a slower change because it changes the value that is used to calculate the function. So it's like an exploration, slower exploration of the state space. No, basically, you explore the changes in the state space, in the phase space, sorry. And of course, you can have 3 or more dynamical scales. When it's useful or not, it's a different matter because you can adjust the parameters of the search algorithm, as I was saying. You can adjust the evaporation rate, you can adjust the speeds of the particles in PSO, you can adjust the mutation rate in genetic algorithms. So this would be like meta heuristics. And actually, PSO was originally applied, if I'm not, if I remember properly, it was first applied to find the weights for a network. So it was like an algorithm to find the parameters for another algorithm. And let's say in many cases, this is becoming more and more common. So this can be represented in the sense that, let's say if you have a function, you can explore different parameters of that function, but then with your search algorithm, you will have different functions, and then you want to explore different values of those different functions as you change the positions of the particles or adjust the weights of a neural network. As you make changes, as the algorithm makes changes in the computing network, then that leads to changes in the function for different points. And then if you change another, let's say how the parameters of the algorithm change, then that would give a third time scale at which you are changing the way in which the function space changes. Yeah, so I mean, in principle, you could go as many layers as you want. The question is when is it useful? Because of course this becomes computationally very expensive. So you can also see that there are different functional scales, not only temporal scales, as in the previous slides. So the nodes are the smallest scale, unless you have like nodes that are made of other networks. But let's say you have like local function, and then the global function will be the network itself. But you can have intermediate scales like subnetworks, model layers, or motifs, and so on. And basically, in a computing network or in one of these algorithms that can be represented as computing networks, you combine the local functions to compute a global function. And you cannot reduce this global function to the individual functions alone, because you need also to consider the edges. You need to consider the interactions. You can see the interactions as operators, which integrate information that is computed by the local structures. So you could say that the global complexity is greater than the local complexities. And you can see this with cellular automata, that if you just study the complexity of individual cells and not consider their interactions, then you can't do much. And there's an open question: when is it useful to have more than 2 functional scales, or not? I mean, because I mean, I can tell you, well, it depends on the problem, and I kind of give you an answer, but that doesn't tell you much. So, I mean, we know that we will not find like a general solution because it depends on the precise problem, but it would be useful to find criteria in order to tell us, hey, you are facing this type of problem with 2 scales is enough, or better use 3, or better use 4. And that's an open question. So if we want to ask which architecture is best, neural networks optimization or particle swarm optimization, well, already from the no-free lunch theorems from the 90s, we know that there's no architecture or algorithm, search algorithm that's best for all possible problems. Not only that it's not best for all possible problems but that it's not better than random search. And these results might seem counterintuitive, but the thing is that this applies for all possible search spaces. And when you consider those, most possible all these possible search spaces, most of these will be random. So there will be no correlation between neighboring positions. So you have what is called a very rugged landscape. So of course, in this type of landscape, random search is as good as you can get, because there are no correlations between neighboring regions of the phase space, of the search space. Sorry. So I mean, this is well known, but then of course, if we restrict ourselves to the I don't know whether it's the right word, but let's call them interesting search spaces. Well, the ones that we want to find solutions for, most of these are not random. They do have structure. So it's another open question, like, okay, if we have certain knowledge about the structure of search space, then how can we design algorithms to explore this better? And that's an open question. What some colleagues in Italy were proposing was like to do like a meta search, like, okay, we will implement all these classic search algorithms and we will run them in parallel. Because, for example, traditionally you would kind of make a walk and explore different solutions, and for very specific problems this is good, but for most problems it's better if you explore different solutions in parallel. So with genetic algorithms you have a population, the same with unforeseen optimization, with particle swarm optimization, you have several solutions being explored in parallel. And what they suggest is like, well, let's have different methods explore the problem in parallel. And of course, one of them will be the best, and for different problems, different ones will be the best. And you cannot get worse than using just one of them, because even if there was just one that for the specific problem that you are studying would always be the best, then you are also using that, and it will be, in the worst case, you will get the same effect as just using one method. But most probably you will get better than using several in parallel than just using one. But okay, that's the no-free-lunch theorem. And we could ask, okay, which architecture is more computationally powerful? Conjecture is that they're all computationally equivalent. But again, remember that there's this difference between computation in theory, which would be Turing's definition, and computation in practice, in the sense that I can imagine that you could build, for example, a neural network with unforeseen optimization and vice versa. So like that, let's say they can compute same type of functions, or you could compute a universal Turing machine using each of these methods, just like with the game of life. That doesn't mean that in practice the game of life can compute everything, because it just takes lots of evaluations, and it's also difficult to program. So if we are just pragmatic and say, okay, which one is easier to program or which one is faster to find solutions, then that's a different question, and very probably they won't be equivalent. And yeah, so we can apply this idea of computing networks also to cognition. For my master's thesis in Sussex, I explored different cognitive architectures, and let's say the main result is a bit similar to the no-free-lunch theorem, that depending on what you want to evaluate, which type of cognition, not only different cognitions might be more appropriate, but also since they seem to be universally computable in practice, then you can use one architecture to model another architecture. So in theory, you cannot say that one is better than the other. And in practice, it will depend on specific circumstances, which one is the best. But anyway, I didn't mention that all this idea of computing networks was originally developed because Vito Toriani and Elio Tucci invited me to collaborate in a special issue on swarm cognition. And so we're speaking about 10 years ago. Some people were comparing what are the cognitive abilities of brains compared to the cognitive abilities of swarms. Because there are similarities, so it's like, okay, are they equivalent or not? So anyway, they invited me, and then I thought about this, and this is the result. And then the paper was rejected from that special issue, and I submitted to a different journal, and then it got published. But anyway, that's the longer story. But anyway, we can define arbitrarily cognition as the ability of compute a function f. And then, in theory, neural and swarm architectures have similar cognitive capacities because they are all able to compute that function f. In practice, there is a big difference, but this depends more on the implementation than on the architecture. So, for example, human brains have like 10 to the 11 neurons and 10 to the 14 synapses. I think sperm whales are the largest brains in our planet so far. I don't know how many neurons they have, whether they have more or less, because neurons come in different sizes, so it could be that they have less neurons, but they're bigger or heavier. I don't know how many neurons sperm whales have. If somebody knows, it would be interesting to know. Maybe dolphins have more. They have larger brains as well. But whether they have more neurons or not, I don't know. And synapses, but it doesn't matter. The thing is that the largest swarms that have been found are more on the order of 10 to the 6, let's say, of 1 million individuals. And also the timescales at which swarms can exchange information, it's scales of seconds or minutes. And also the number of neighbors that they can affect with pheromones. I don't know, perhaps a few dozens bees doing the waggle dance. It's just like the number of bees that can be around them. So the transmission of information is much slower in insect swarms than in brains that you have millisecond scale or tens of millisecond scales when that neurons can exchange information. And also single neuron can have, I don't know how many hundreds of dendrites, or I don't know whether they reach even thousands, but I'm pretty sure that they can transmit information to more neurons than insects. So in practice, neural, brains, because it doesn't have to do with the architecture, it has to do with the implementation. They're more capable than swarms. But then if we abstract them computationally, a computer kind of can easily assume that a swarm, you can build swarms of the size of your computer's memory, and then you can update them as fast as you would update an artificial neural network. So of course, in the computational, let's say, side, with digital computers, then you would have to see at the computational complexity of each of the algorithms to see which one might learn faster. And very probably, again, this will be varying with the problem that you're exploring. So we can have alternative descriptions of the same phenomena. So we can describe them as multi-agent systems that are self-organizing, and this would be comparable to speaking about the distributed computation of F. This doesn't change the models, it's just a different description that might or might not be useful depending on purposes. Another alternative would be in terms of information. We will speak more about this next week, where you have you basically describe nodes, edges, algorithms, and functions in terms of information. And computation is simply a change of information. So you can use the same formalism to describe all the components of computing networks. And of course, it's not that one description is better than the other. They're suitable for different contexts. So for example, computing networks were proposed for comparing these architectures. Self-organization can be used for engineering and describing phenomena in terms of information for exploring general principles in our universe. So, I mean, one conclusion we could extract is that the world is not random, which is like, well, of course, in the sense that if it were random, then let's say the computation, of course, would be less sophisticated. Let's call it that way. But let's say if you would have all the same probabilities of finding any type of information, as opposed to how it is now, that there are certain configurations of matter, energy, and information that are much more probable than the majority of all possible configurations, then this gives structure to our universe. And this means that the world is not random, and it means that we can explore it, because otherwise search would be reduced to random search. Yeah. And since it isn't random, then we can use algorithms to explore it in a more efficient way. So just to conclude, swarm and neural architectures share similar computational and cognitive abilities in theory. In practice, it depends more on the implementation. By studying the general principles that enable computing networks to perform complex computation, we could understand better what are the requirements for neural and swarm systems to exhibit complex cognition. And we can also appreciate the importance of multiple dynamical and functional scales. And here's the reference, and also there's a preprint available. But very probably I'll share the paper in the Google Classroom. Okay, so for next Tuesday, in the classroom, there's already a link to a paper by Dirk Helbing on global risks. That it's interesting because it's, I think, 2013 or 14, and of course some things have changed, and maybe it's not valid in some aspects, but in some other aspects it's kind of interesting that it speaks about the threats of pandemic, and now we kind of are experiencing the results of those risks. So it will be interesting to discuss about that on Tuesday. And on Thursday, I will tell you about this idea of describing the world as evolving information. And for the next week, probably it would be good to hear from you about your advances from your final projects. So the idea in the next round of presentations is to already have some preliminary results. Because I mean, you already have an idea of what you wanted to do, so now you should be doing this already. And in the next presentation, to be able to show whether that thing that you already did is on the right track, or better to change project. You are still in good time to change project if it turns out that let's say results are not encouraging. Yeah, that we would see in the last week of March. Are there any questions?
No, no one.
So Lucrecia writes, the processing time and memory used when learning or performing a task are useful factors to determine if the chosen architecture is correct. It actually depends on what you're interested in. So for example, in the literature of search algorithms, you can use different measures, and sometimes people are a bit sneaky in the sense that they will calculate different measures, but then they just publish the ones that in which the method they're proposing are performing good, because you could on the one hand you could try to get a better solution, no? So that would be like a better precision to but then in some cases the algorithms that find like very good solutions, they're computationally more expensive, so they take longer to reach to that solution. So some people will say, okay, this is an algorithm that it's very fast. It will not give you the best possible solution, but it will give you a good enough solution. I don't know, 98% to the optimum, but it will do it, I don't know, in 30% of the time. And that's already valuable, because in some cases, in some applications, you don't need that extra precision, and you really need to do it fast, or spending less energy. Yeah, you could also try to optimize like the amount of memory that you use to find the solution, or the number of instructions that you use. So, I mean, these are strongly correlated with time, no? But perhaps you are interested in finding an algorithm that kind of is the most ecologically friendly, basically that it spends less energy to find a good enough solution. So yeah, there are, and in some other cases, it will depend more on the experience of the developer than on the algorithm itself. Because if someone has experience, I don't know, with genetic algorithms, and maybe she faces a problem where I don't know, neural networks are slightly better, but if she has never worked with neural networks, then it might be better that she uses genetic algorithms, because she will know the nuances on how to explore the mutation rate, so that she will find better solutions, and then she can develop in less time a better solution than if she starts from scratch learning neural networks, and okay, which type of neural networks, and so on. But yeah, I guess that at the end, it not only depends on your purposes, but if you can do this like many different search algorithms in parallel, that will be the best, which is what these Italian colleagues were proposing. And now that you have libraries of many different optimization methods that are available, then it's really quick to explore which ones work best, because you don't need to program everything from scratch. So, for example, a few years ago, that we had a couple of projects with SAT, the Mexican equivalent to the IRS, basically the agency that collects taxes. They gave us a huge data set with some it was about 81 million how do you say contribuyente in English? Well, they can be people or companies, entities, let's call them tax entities.
Taxpayers.
81 million taxpayers, yes. So they can be, they're called physical if they're people, and moral if they are companies. So 81 million, and then 7 billion transactions across 4 years. And then a small data set of less than 10,000 tax evaders that they had identified. So the idea was to try to generalize and identify other tax evaders based on the data, a very small data set that they gave us. So we basically start exploring with so many different methods. And at the end, we combine them. So let's say we explored more that didn't work, but from the ones that worked, we combined 3, which were deep neural networks, random forests, and methods from network science. And what we did was, so in parallel, we trained the deep neural network, we trained the random forests, and each one gave us like 100,000 suspicious taxpayers that had data they had patterns similar to the ones of tax evaders. But then they were overlapping about half. So let's say they each gave us a bit more than 100,000, but then there were like 48,000 that both methods had identified as suspicious. So we thought, okay, these guys have higher probability of being tax evaders because both methods classify them as such. And then from those, we looked at the network of transactions, which is basically who gives invoices to whom. And then we kind of restricted even more the list. So basically, if you are close to, so yeah, I mean, the tax evasion works in such a way that I want to evade taxes. So I hire a company that will give me an invoice, and then I can deduce the taxes, and for a service that never existed. So they're called businesses that give invoices for simulated operations. And I mean, the government already identified a few thousand, but then you could easily find some others because the people who actually do this, they use companies, but they have several companies, and then they give invoices from different companies, and then they kind of make a carousel so that these companies don't pay taxes, and it's like a very complicated Ponzi scheme. But then if you already know that a tax evader gives invoices to a group of clients, and then there's another company that gives invoices to the same group of clients, very probably it's part of the same operation. So we use network methods to kind of increase the probability of or the degree of suspiciousness, let's call it that way, that the 2 other methods had already identified. So yeah, I mean, in some cases it's better to combine methods than just to trust one and say, okay, this is the good one. Well, Elio asks in the chat about yesterday's conference about probability of a rank still in same position, unpredictability and persistence. Well, in real data sets, I mean, it's just, we just get the data. So then we can, using this data, estimate probabilities. And in some data sets, some elements will stay in a rank for longer or shorter. And what we saw in the data is that if they are close to the top, they remain in that position for longer on average than if they are in the middle. And for closed systems also, if they're in the bottom of the rank. And then with our simple model with random displacement and replacement, then you can reproduce those probabilities. Doesn't mean that the mechanism is the same because we just use random replacement and displacement. But it means that the dynamics of ranking seem to be very general, independently of the mechanism behind them. So,
thank you.
Yeah. I mean, since we're speaking about probabilities, then that limits your predictability.
Yeah, exactly. But which measure is the predictivity, and which measure is the unpredictability? I mean, the persistence. How do you measure? I know you have the probability that the value that the rank stay in the same position.
Yep.
What is the name for that, and what is unpredictability in terms of that probability?
Yeah, I mean, as such, we didn't calculate like, okay, this is the how unpredictable this data set is. But you can see that this type of rank dynamics limit predictability considerably, but they do so less for elements at the top of the rank than elements in the middle of the rank. So it's not so much that we calculate precisely the predictability of each element in this work, but let's say observing the general behavior of rank dynamics, then you can say that the top ranks are more predictable than the middle of the rank. So let's say that's what I was speaking, that in sports, different sports are more or less predictable because, yeah, I mean, from the data, you can get like, okay, this team is better than this other one because it's ranked higher. What's the probability that they will win the lower ranked team? And in some sports, it's with very high probability, the highest ranked team will win. But in other sports, it's almost a coin toss. But still, independently on that, you can bet on the let's say, if you want to play sure, you should always bet to the highest ranked team.
Okay.
Because of course there's a small probability that, yeah, there's a small probability that the lower ranked team will win, and of course you get higher earnings. Yeah, I mean that's why gambling works.
Then the predictability is that probability is going from 0 to 1, and then what about persistence? Which role play persistence in this?
Yeah, so let me better tell about how we reach these measures, because we wanted to measure a couple of things. One, what is the probability that someone that just entered the ranking will reach number one, which you could call it success or something. And then what's the probability that the top rank will stay in the top rank, or if you already reach the top 10, what's the probability that you will stay in the top 10? So I don't know, we were playing with the names for these measures, and I suggested the Phelps Index because I mean, this already like 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, Michael Phelps had won like always all the swimming competitions he participated, so he was always number one until he retired. And but then a more general way of seeing this, it's arbitrarily what's the probability that one element will kind of go from one segment of the ranking to another segment of the ranking arbitrarily. And yeah, and that's explored with more detail in the supplementary information of the paper.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlos.
Yep. Yeah, so the Domingo write something that reminds me that I wanted to discuss this with you again. So from the physical sciences graduate program, the coordinator sent an email telling that I think not next week, but the week after, we should do all efforts possible to return to on-site activities. So I guess we can do it. Then the classes would be at the same hour, but in the Center for Complexity Sciences, which is next to Universum. I can't remember when I asked this, maybe a couple of weeks ago, and nobody raised their hand that they would go. So that's why we continued remotely. But then I'll just ask again if anyone would be willing or prefer to go to in-person classes. I mean, we're almost at the middle of the semester, but I know that for some people it's complicated for different reasons. Either they live far from here or they have other courses just before or just after. So going on campus from one side to the other, it's not an easy thing unless you're biking. Yeah, so I mean, if no one would be in the position of going to in-person classes, then yeah, we will just continue like this. Don't let the coordinators pressure you.
Well, for me, maybe it's a good idea to go presential, but the idea to go to the two sites because my other class is in the ¿cómo se llama? In the IMAS, maybe.
Yes.
Probably it's the time maybe a problem, but I want to try it.
At what time is your class?
It's 1 hour. Es una hora después.
Okay.
A la 1.
Yeah. Shoichi asks that whether we will continue online. Yes, that's one of the reasons for having them at the C3, because we can have the streaming from the auditorium. So everyone that cannot go in person, then it will be the same channel and so on. So Lucrecia says that she can also go. Well, yeah. Why don't we try, and then we'll see how it goes. If I'm alone in the C3 teaching, then probably we'll go back to as we are now. Oscar, ¿estaría bien para ti empezar no la próxima semana, sino en 2 semanas? Well, I have to double check with the C3. I think it shouldn't be a problem, but in principle, we could start on the 29th, Tuesday. And then we can see how many show up at the C3 auditorium. Oscar, lo checo con Ana Leonor de cualquier manera y te pongo copia para ver que la logística también se puede y ya lo discutimos por correo. Yeah, so I'll confirm whether we can do it, and I'll announce it in the classroom. Okay, so if there aren't any more issues or questions or complaints, I'll see you next Tuesday. Have a great weekend.